Winter and Spring 1945. As Allied troops advanced across Europe toward Germany, they encountered Nazi concentration camps and liberated thousands of prisoners. In the camps, combat-hardened soldiers witnessed firsthand the brutality and inhumanity of the Nazi regime and its so-called policies of racial superiority. They found piles of unburied corpses and barracks filled with dead and dying prisoners. The small percentage of inmates who survived often required immediate assistance after months and years of maltreatment, starvation, and forced labor at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators.
Concentration camp in the Gotha area, the Germans starved, clubbed, and burned to death more than 4,000 political prisoners over a period of 8 months. A few captives survived by hiding in the woods. The camp is chosen for a high command inspection led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also present are Generals Omar N. Bradley and George S. Patton. The 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army liberated this camp early in April. The generals view the rack that was used by the Nazis to whip the inmates.
Dark Dawn, Part 4, The Liberation of the Camps, A Reckoning with History. So I'm sorry about the background, guys. It's been storming and it hasn't stopped storming for days. So you're going to hear the rain hitting the roof. I have a tin roof, so you're going to hear the rain. Just bear with me through the story. Today we're going to remember one of the most harrowing yet pivotal moments in human history. The Allied liberation of the Nazi concentration camps during World War II. It is a story of unimaginable suffering, of resilience, and the moment when the world could no longer turn away from the horrors that had unfolded. As the war in Europe neared its end, Allied forces pushed deeper into Nazi-occupied territory. What they found defied comprehension. The first major camp to be liberated was Majdanek, near Lublin, Poland, in July 1944.
My very clear view of freedom and liberation came that morning when I stood in this doorway of that abandoned factory. And I saw a car coming down the hill. And the reality of that came when I saw the white star on its hood and not the swastika. Of humanity, of humaneness, of dignity, of freedom.
We went inside the factory. It was an indescribable scene. There were women scattered over the floor on scraps of straw, some of them quite obviously with a mark of death on their faces.
I took him to see my friends.
The girl who was my guide made sort of a sweeping gesture over this scene of devastation and said the following words: "Noble be man, merciful and good." And I could hardly believe that she was able to summon a poem by the German poet Goethe, which is called The Divine, at such a moment. And there was nothing that she could have said that would have underscored the grim irony of the situation better than.
The Soviet Red Army arrived to find much of the camp intact, gas chambers still standing, a chilling testament to the atrocities committed within its walls. The Nazis, aware of the advance in Allied forces, attempted to erase evidence of their crimes. They forced prisoners on brutal death marches, evacuating camps in the east, and sending thousands to overcrowded camps deeper in Germany. Many perished along the way, succumbing to exhaustion, starvation, or executions. One such camp was Dachau.
Dachau, Factory of Horrors. Dachau, near München, one of the oldest of the Nazi prison camps. It is known that from 1941 to 1944, up to 30,000 people were entombed here at one time, and 30,000 were present when the Allies reached Dachau. The Nazis said it was a prison for political dissenters, habitual criminals, and religious enthusiasts. When these scenes were filmed, over 1,600 priests, representing many denominations, still remained alive. They came from Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and Holland. Incoming prison trains arrived, carrying more dead than living. Those strong enough to travel were brought to Dachau from outlying points which were threatened by the Allied advance. This is how they looked when they arrived. Some survived, and when the rescuers arrived, they administered what aid they could. Others died after the liberation. They were buried by their fellow prisoners. As in the case of other camps, local townspeople were brought in to view the dead at Dachau. This is what the liberators found inside the buildings. Hanging in orderly rows were the clothes of prisoners who had been suffocated in a lethal gas chamber. They had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower, for which towels and soap were provided.
As the Allies closed in on Nazi-occupied territory, the SS sought to conceal the atrocities committed in concentration camps. Their solution was brutal: forced evacuations known as death marches. These marches were not just a means of relocating prisoners. They were deliberate acts of cruelty, designed to eliminate witnesses and continue the suffering of those who had already endured unimaginable horrors.
Well, at that time I was commanding a task force consisting of my infantry battalion of about 900 men. I got a radio message ordering me to proceed to the concentration camp of Dachau and to seize it, seal it off, and to let no one in or out. So I ordered the company commander to take on that mission. And I told him, since I had not the faintest idea what we would encounter, that I would go with him.
You know, it's a crazy thing. There was no doubt about it. I don't think at the time I even knew what the hell was going on here. There was certainly none of this stuff had been told to us. As a matter of fact, when we get to the town of Dachau, nobody had said boo to me about what atrocities were out here, or what the hell was going on. I don't think they even told Sparks what to expect. We didn't expect this shit. I thought it was going to be a prisoner of war camp or something. But let me tell you, half a mile behind us were all kinds of the press and all kinds of goody gumdrop people, what have you, and they knew, or they expected they knew, or they had a feeling, but they knew something hot was in this camp, and they knew something was wrong, and there was something there. I had no indication of that.
I was not prepared for what I saw in Dachau. Nothing could prepare you for that. Nothing could prepare you for that type of slaughter that was carried on in that camp.
And it's the most god-awful smell you'd ever want to smell in your life. And you know, you try to hold yourself together, and you try to make yourself, you know, you say, I don't know, you're trying to tell yourself that you can control yourself. And I looked at my buddy, Bobby McDonald, and whereas he was just in complete tears, and so then I busted out. And I think, looking around, I think most of the guys were all complete teary eyes. And I know our lieutenant was really upset. He would start really cussing the Germans. He said, God knows what he was saying about the Krauts, you know what I mean? But he was very angry too. Everyone was. And it was a very, very, I don't know. you almost start getting a savage feeling out of it yourself, like you, some sort of way of getting revenge or something like this. And but still not knowing what you're really coming up against. You still had no idea what you were coming up against. We didn't know if there was 10 people up there waiting for us. We didn't know if there was 100, 200, 300 or what. We knew there was guards. They said that, the rumor has it there was guards still up there, and there was some SS there and that sort of thing, they said. And but these are things, guys talking and all, you really don't know. There's nothing official, So then we started making our approach.
The largest death march occurred in January 1945, just days before the Soviet Red Army reached Auschwitz. The Nazis forced 56,000 prisoners to march 35 miles to a train station in Woodslaw, where they were crammed into freight cars and transported to other camps. Around 15,000 prisoners died along the way, succumbing to exhaustion, exposure, or execution. Prisoners were often marched for miles in freezing temperatures, wearing only thin uniforms and without food or water. Those who collapsed were shot on the spot. Some were transported by train, packed into cattle cars for days without sustenance. The SS abandoned many camps entirely, killing large numbers of prisoners before the marches even began. The death marches were not just a desperate attempt to relocate prisoners, they were a final act of mass murder. By the time the war ended, the estimated 250,000 prisoners had perished in those forced evacuations. Survivors of the marches were often sent to overcrowded camps deeper in Germany, where conditions were equally as dire.
A day before these Nazis visited the camp, the Burgermeister of Ohrdruf was forced to view the horrors. He and his wife were later found dead in their home, apparently suicides. American officers arrive at a Nazi institution seized by First Army troops. Under the guise of an insane asylum, this has been the headquarters for the systematic murder of 35,000 Poles, Russians, and Germans sent here mainly for political and religious considerations. Those still alive are examined by Major Hermann Bolker of the American War Crimes Investigation Team. The townspeople in Hadamar, Germany, called this place the House of Shudders. Meanwhile, at the graveyard attached to the institution, bodies are exhumed for autopsy. 20,000 are buried here. 15,000 who died in a lethal gas chamber were cremated and their ashes interred. Death books found hidden in the wine cellar of the Hadamar institution revealed part of the story of the mass killings. The bulky volumes contained thousands of death certificates. Profession unknown, nationality unknown was written after each name. Interrogating the institution heads, Daman, the taller man, was the top Nazi in charge of the place. The other man entering the room is Karl Willig, chief male nurse. He admits to killing inmates with overdoses of morphine. The testimony of other witnesses substantiated the fact that morphine was issued at the institution without attempt at making a record. As many as 17 at a time died from the morphine injections. The investigating officers were told that the Nazis never bothered to determine whether a victim may have survived the overdosage. Instead, all were hustled off to the graveyard and buried in piles of 20 to 24. The prisoners are removed to await trial. A Hadamar judge told the investigators that when the 10,000th victim died, the institution heads and Nazi officials staged a celebration.
One of the counts guilty of the death marches was Auschwitz. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz, the largest and most infamous of the Nazi death counts. Over 1 million people had been murdered there. The Red Army found only a few thousand survivors, those too weak to be marched away. The SS had attempted to destroy evidence, blowing up crematoriums and burning warehouses filled with victims' belongings. In the West, U.S. forces liberated Ohrdruf on April 5, 1945, followed by Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen.
Concentration camp in the Gotha area, the Germans starved, clubbed, and burned to death more than 4,000 political prisoners over a period of 8 months. A few captives survived by hiding in the woods. The camp is chosen for a high command inspection led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also present are Generals Omar N. Bradley and George S. Patton. The 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army liberated this camp early in April. The generals view the rack that was used by the Nazis to whip the inmates. They see the woodshed where lime-covered bodies are stacked in layers and the stench is overpowering. Former inmates demonstrate how they were tortured by the Nazis. American congressmen invited to view the atrocities were told by General Eisenhower, "Nothing is covered up. We have nothing to conceal. The barbarous treatment these people received in the German concentration camps is almost unbelievable. I want you to see for yourselves and be the spokesman for the United States." The general and his party next see the crude woodland crematory, actually a grill made of railway tracks. Here the bodies of victims were cremated. Charred remains of several inmates still lay heaped atop the grill. Another group to visit the Ohrdruf camp is composed of local townspeople, including prominent Nazi party members. They'll be taken on a forced tour of the campsite by Colonel Haydn Sears, commander of the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, which captured Ohrdruf. A German medical major is compelled to accompany the townspeople.
British forces reached Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, where they found 60,000 starving prisoners and thousands of unburied corpses. Disease ran rampant, and even after liberation, many survivors were too weak to digest food. On April 15, 1945, British forces entered Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp near Hanover, Germany. What they found was beyond imagination. 60,000 prisoners, many on the brink of death.
I want you to know that when the war ended, I weighed the equivalent of probably 70 pounds. And I was skin and bone. And I do remember that when that British soldier came and asked me, he said, can he do something for me? And I said to him, I'd like 2 things. I'd like him to bring me warm socks. We're talking, this was already May. It was warm. I was cold. I wanted warm socks, kneeling socks. And I wanted sugar. So he brought me, I was craving sugar, I suppose. He brought me socks. And I do remember 2 things. I remember when I put on the socks and I started to cry because I didn't have any calf. I was all bones and the kneeling socks wouldn't stay on. But I also remember that when he gave me the sugar, and it may not have been more than maybe a quarter of a pound, maybe a little bag of sugar. But it was, maybe, as I say, sugar, just plain sugar. I took that bag and I just poured it into my mouth. I just ate it like that. And I remember it because he got scared and he ran out looking for the nurses. Because he thought, God knows what I did to myself by eating all this sugar. And I remember the nurse said to him in German that it's okay, I was probably just craving sugar.
Thousands of corpses scattered across the camp. The camp had originally been established as a prisoner of war camp in 1940, but later become a concentration camp. By the time of liberation, it was severely overcrowded, with typhus, dysentery, and starvation rampant among the inmates. The conditions were so dire that the Germans had agreed to a truce, allowing British forces to take control without resistance to prevent the spread of disease. Upon arrival, British soldiers were horrified. Bodies lay unburied and survivors were too weak to move. Brigadier Hughes, a senior British medical officer, described seeing evidence of cannibalism, as some prisoners had resorted to eating the remains of the dead. The British immediately began relief efforts, focusing on burying the dead, containing disease, and restoring water supplies, and distributing food. Despite their efforts, 14,000 prisoners died after liberation, too weak to recover. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen was a turning point to the world's understanding of the Holocaust. British forces documented the horrors, ensuring that atrocities were exposed to the world. The camp commandant, Joseph Kramer, was arrested and later tried for war crimes. The liberation of these camps was not just a military victory, it was a moral reckoning. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of war, were shaken to their core by what they witnessed. Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon visiting Ohrdruf, insisted that journalists and politicians see the camp firsthand, declaring, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he's fighting for. Now at least he will know what he's fighting against."
At this concentration camp in the Gotha area, the Germans starved, clubbed, and burned to death more than 4,000 political prisoners over a period of 8 months. A few captives survived by hiding in the woods. The camp is chosen for a high command inspection led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also present are Generals Omar N. Bradley and George S. Patton. The 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army liberated this camp early in April. The generals view the rack that was used by the Nazis to whip the inmates. Colonel Sears stands by as the Nazis are informed that they must see all the horrors at the camp. First, the visitors view some 30 freshly killed bodies lying in the courtyard of the camp where they'd been shot on the evening preceding the entry of American tanks. These two are identified as slave labor bosses who maltreated, tortured, and killed their workers. Next, to the woodshed, which the Nazis are reluctant to enter, but Colonel Sears demands that they get a close-up look at the most gruesome of sights. The labor bosses enter. According to reports, the local Nazis continued their tour of the camp without apparent emotion. All denied knowledge of what had taken place at Ohrdruf. They are taken to the crematory 2 miles outside the camp, where the list of the atrocities is read for all to hear. The 4,000 Ohrdruf victims are said to include Poles, Czechs, Russians, Belgians, Frenchmen, German Jews, and German political prisoners. The day before these Nazis visited the camp, the Burgermeister of Ohrdruf was forced to view the horrors. He and his wife were later found dead in their home, apparently suicides. American officers arrive at a Nazi institution seized by 1st Army troops. Under the guise of an insane asylum, this has been the headquarters for the systematic murder of 35,000 Poles, Russians, and Germans sent here mainly for political and religious considerations. Those still alive are examined by Major Hermann Bolker of the American War Crimes Investigation Team. The townspeople in Hadamar, Germany, called this place the House of Shudders. Meanwhile, at the graveyard attached to the institution, bodies are exhumed for autopsy. 20,000 are buried here. 15,000 who died in a lethal gas chamber were cremated and their ashes interred. Death books found hidden in the wine cellar of the Hadamar institution revealed part of the story of the mass killings. The bulky volumes contained thousands of death certificates. Profession unknown, nationality unknown was written after each name. The corpses are lined up pending the arrival of WCIT officers. Major Bolker performs the autopsy. A detailed listing is made of all clinical data. Interrogating the institution heads, Don, the taller man, was the top Nazi in charge of the place. The other man entering the room is Karl Willig, chief male nurse. He admits to killing inmates with overdoses of morphine. The testimony of other witnesses substantiated the fact that morphine was issued at the institution without attempt at making a record. As many as 17 at a time died from the morphine injections. The investigating officers were told that the Nazis never bothered to determine whether a victim may have survived the overdosage. Instead, all were hustled off to the graveyard and buried in piles of 20 to 24. The prisoners are removed to await trial. A Hadamar judge told the investigators that when the 10,000th victim died, the institution heads and Nazi officials staged a celebration.
For the survivors, liberation was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. Many had lost their families, their homes, and their health. The world struggled to comprehend the scale of the Holocaust, and justice was sought through the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were held accountable for their crimes.
Well, the camp was a mile or so off to my left. My left front was not in our original attack zone. But when we had very accurate maps, and we found the camp easily. As we approached the camp, which from the outside looked like an ordinary military post, like any military post in the world actually, with a masonry wall about 8 feet high surrounding it, and an double iron gate which was locked. Leading into the camp, or on one side of the camp, as we approached, there was a railroad track, and on that track and outside of the camp were 39 railway cars of various types, mostly box cars and open type cars, which are called gondolas. When we approached those cars, we saw that every car was crammed full of dead bodies. We saw where 2 or 3 of the people had strength enough to fall out of the cars onto the pavement which ran along beside the railroad track. And their heads had been crushed in, apparently with a rifle butt, and their brains were scattered around on the pavement. As we checked the cars very hastily, all 39 of them, and each one was crammed with dead bodies, both men and women, mostly men, but a few women. We found no signs of life. This came as a very terrible shock to us. Well, about an hour and a half after we'd entered the camp, of course, we radioed back that we had secured the camp, and of course, 7th Army headquarters, we were part of the 7th United States Army. We were immediately aware of the fact that we had taken the camp. About an hour and a half after the entry, when things were very calm, I was standing at the gate to the camp, a beautiful iron to the concentration camp itself. There was a bridge that ran over the moat, and this big, beautiful iron gate, which had on it a sign that work makes one free, in German, or something to that effect. Because they worked those prisoners to death, actually, just on stupid tasks, you know, pushing a wagon around that was loaded with rocks or anything to humiliate them. I was standing there at the gate talking to one of my officers about the security, and suddenly a party of 3 jeeps came up to this gate. Unknown to me, my men had broken the lock off of the main gate to the post itself. I forgot to tell them not to do that, but I never thought of it, to tell you the truth. In any event, they had opened the main gate to the camp, and these 3 jeeps came in, and they came up to the bridge across the moat leading into the concentration camp. And in the lead jeep was a General Linden from the 42nd Infantry Division. With him was a woman reporter by the name of Marguerite Higgins, who I think represented Time, Life, and I don't know what all, but she was quite a famous reporter, both in World War II and I think in Korea and perhaps in Vietnam. In any event, the general told me, he said, this lady would like to go in and interview some prisoners. She wants to interview Cardinal Niemöller, and I thought he said the Prince of Luxembourg, and another name. Well, the names meant nothing to me. As it turned out, they weren't there anyway, but they had been there, but had been evacuated prior to our arrival. But in any event, I said, no. You see those people pressing up against that gate? I said, there are thousands of people there, and they were right up against the gate. They would like to get out. If we open that gate, we have pandemonium on our hands. She cannot go in there. He said, well, she's going in, and I'm taking charge. And while I was arguing with him, she got out of the Jeep, and while my back was sort of turned, there was a restraining bar on this iron gate that went into the camp, and she opened it. Well, the prisoners surged forward in a great mass. I heard them yelling. I turned around and I saw them surging forward through the gate. I then yelled at my men to start shooting. Shoot over their heads, I yelled, and charge that gate and get it closed. So my men started running towards the gate, firing their rifles over the heads of the prisoners. And they drove them back and got the gate closed. Well, this lady reporter frightened her. She ran back to the Jeep. So I said, "General, you'll have to get your party out of here." No, he said, "No, I'm relieving you of command." I said, "You're not my commander. You're from another division. I take orders only from my own commanders. And my orders were not to let anyone in or out. And that includes you and the rest of your party. Now get out." He refused to go, so the argument got quite heated. And finally I pulled my pistol and put it up against him and said, well, first I had a private standing there by the Jeep. I said, "Private, escort the general and his party out." So the private kind of stepped forward. This general was a dandy who carried a riding crop, a leather riding crop. When the private stepped forward, the general hit him over the helmet with his riding crop. Didn't hurt the boy. Probably maybe rang his bell a little bit, but with a helmet on it didn't hurt him, but it made a good crack. So I pulled my pistol and I said, "If you touch another one of my men, I'll kill you." So that frightened him. He said, "Okay, I'll see you before a general court-martial." But they left. He caused trouble later, a lot of trouble later, but they left. They immediately filed a report that the 42nd Infantry Division had captured Dachau. But that was the closest they came to it, was that little excursion of those 3 Jeeps. He had some other officers with him, had a battalion commander and some staff officers with him in the other Jeeps. But they left and I never saw him again. After that, it quieted down again. Although within 2 hours, there was an officer there from the Inspector General's Department who started to grill me about what was going on and about General Linden. I told him to leave. I had no time for idle gossip, and he got insulted, but he left.
Today we remember not only the victims, but also the liberators, the soldiers who bore witness, the doctors who worked tirelessly to save lives, and the survivors who rebuilt their lives against all odds. Their stories must never be forgotten. So let us honor their memory by ensuring that history is never erased, that truth is never silenced, and that humanity never allows such darkness to rise again. So thank you for taking a walk with me through the dark dawn of the Holocaust. I hope you enjoyed this history. Have a good day, guys.